Do you think the media on both sides of the political spectrum could be considered to be guilty of stoking differences, creating conflict and stirring up opposition among people who basically have the same interests? Wherever you are, wherever you're from, it's likely that you faced similar problems that are in your life as a result of the interests of very powerful institutions and groups. Nick Estes here talks about how we can all come together to oppose those interests, like billionaires buying up farmland, like tech giants controlling our lives, like centralised governments sticking their oar into your business. Have a listen to what he has to say.
I was politicized in the invasion of Iraq back in 2003, and I went to my first anti-war protest. I was still in high school, and that politicized me. But the kind of politics that young people and the movements today are espousing, and the vision that they have, and the kind of transformational power that they have, I didn't see that as a young person. And so I would say I'm much more hopeful, and it doesn't just like rely on the youth, like to change the world. Like, people our age have to, also be a part of that process. But I would say, even though with the cynical nature of representational politics, the cynical nature of injury politics, the cynical nature of identity politics, the cynical nature of white supremacy, despite all that, I'm incredibly optimistic.
That's lovely. You mentioned earlier the kind of sacred relationship between indigenous people and water, as demonstrated in that speech there that we touched upon. This resacralizing could be seen, as you indicated, not as a kind of the sort of mystical branch of savagery and ignorance, but a kind of rational appreciation of the symbiosis between the inhabitants of the planet and the planet itself. When I hear you say this stuff, man, about like sort of like the Capitol Hill thing, that sort of 40% of them are sort of kind of were business owners and in sort of white collar roles, but simultaneously the veil of whiteness to mask the economic inequality that is central to the kind of politics that we in the EU, I suppose, have in America. I feel that there is a great deal to learn from the historical period that you're sort of citing and drawing from, even with that alliance between the Cowboy Indian alliance, i.e., like the fact is that whether that's apocryphal or if it's inaccurate or not, whether or not Trump. I think there's certainly a sense that Trump appealed to blue-collar Americans. It was part of an anti-elitism, anti-intellectualism. That I can't help but think that the sort of the white supremacy component of that is a kind of an unconscious and ubiquitous attribute, as opposed to central and defining, i.e. the white supremacy is institutional and somewhat transcendent of various political strata. So it's going to be present in the Democrats, it's going to be present in Republicans, it's sort of there anyway. Do you feel that in order to have a meaningful progress, meaningful alternatives, there needs to be a political movement that acknowledges the sacredness of the land, acknowledges the rights of various people, natural inhabitants, descendants of slaves, but also brings somehow to the forefront the interests and rights of white, non-white, all economically underserved communities, brings them together? And isn't part of the problem with identity politics is it allows figures like Biden to shaft indigenous people with like that mental copper mining St. Paul's thing that you talked us through, whilst posturing as a kind of a friend to non-white communities? Isn't that something that needs to be counterposed, and doesn't that counterposition require alliances that go beyond race and enter class?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of to go back to that time period in the Black Hills Alliance, they defeated Union Carbide, they defeated some of the most powerful energy corporations by uniting together, I would say as a class, not as distinct kind of categories. I mean, I think, for PR purposes, it says a lot when you have a Cowboy and Indian alliance, right? But there were miners, gold miners in the Black Hills. And if you know anything about that region, gold mining was key to the theft of our territory. The reason why they took our territory is to get access to gold. And so you had miners unions in the Black Hills who were talking to indigenous people and said, you know what, indigenous rights actually protect us as miners, because it's not like we have a choice. Like nobody like wakes up one day and be like, yeah, I want to be, I want to work in the fossil fuel industry. I want to contribute to climate change. These are real like economic choices for survival that people often have to make, right? And we can't fault them for doing so. So if the only alternative for a job is to work in the oil field or be a prison guard, like you can't fault poor people for making those decisions. They're making survival decisions. But if they begin to understand, like as these miners did, that their safety, their work, their workplace safety is contingent upon living in a healthy environment, and they're using things such as arsenic and mercury to gold mine, they realize that like actually this isn't just about our protection as workers, but the only reason why they got to that point to acknowledge treaty rights, indigenous rights as fundamental to their rights as workers, was because they formed a union, right? And they formed a union because they were organizing against capital. They're organizing against the bosses. And I think that's, we have to understand that these things, I can sit here, you and I can have this conversation. I don't know who's going to, who's listening, at their job place right now and being like, oh, I'm convinced, this happens through struggle. Like it happens through education, right? And I would say that the majority of Americans, whether they hold backwards views or not, if they understood the real history of this country and this land, that they would have a much different opinion. Because, like you said, white supremacy isn't this kind of transcendent, transhistorical phenomenon. It happened. It didn't happen by accident, right? It unfolded throughout history. It looks different throughout, different times and places. It's not the same. It's historically contingent. It's socially produced, and it can be socially defeated as well. So I would say, yes, there has to be, and some kind of, class alliance. I would say it has to be more so based on class than this idea that we can organize on identity. And thinking about these miners, how I actually found out about these miners was because I was doing work with the nurses union out in California. And one of the old kind of like union bosses, he's like, he's like, I knew some Lakota people. And I was like, oh yeah, who did you know? We're a small nation. So it's racist to say that, all Native people know each other, but the reality is we all know each other. but he's like, oh, I knew this person and this. And I was like, what the heck? And it turned out that he was one of those miners, those gold miners, who was involved in adopting an indigenous rights framework as a workers' rights framework in the mines. And I was like, this is incredible, so it shows what is possible, right? And I think this gets to another aspect. When we talk about things such as water is sacred, we have to think about, the term water protector and where that came from. That came from Standing Rock, and that came from the Standing Rock Nation taking a stand against the Dakota Access Pipeline and saying, not only is this water sacred for us as indigenous people, but it's also sacred for the 8 million people who rely on this river for drinking water. And so when anyone would walk through those the protest camp gates, they automatically became a water protector, not because they were indigenous. Many of them were white, many of them were black, many of them, were from all different kinds of backgrounds. And so it was a universal, kind of label. It didn't just apply to indigenous people. It was centered on indigenous values, but it showed that our struggles aren't some kind of tack on issue, that everyone can be a water protector, and that this is something that should be ingrained in our society. This is something that should be valued. And if we think about water protectors, land defenders throughout history, if we think about the indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest who are protecting the very oxygen, the very lungs that we all need to survive, they're being criminalized for their jobs, right? That's their job, right? That's their job, is to protect that environment. They don't get paid for it, right? But they get criminalized for it. And we can think about, this is necessary for life on this planet to continue, but yet it's a devalued form of labor and work. much like, we think of the kind of division of gender and gendered labor, such as caretaking, child rearing, and all of those things as falling on women, and they don't get paid for that, but it's necessary for the reproduction of life, right? So this is a reorientation of values and how we understand work, how we understand, our relationship to the natural environment, because it's not just something that like is our problem as Indigenous people, it's everybody's problem. Everybody has an investment to protect clean water, clean land, and also, the Amazon rainforest. Like I want the next generation to breathe, a clean air and to experience clean drinking water.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you can go over to Luminary now and listen to the rest of it. I do one brilliant conversation a week with academics, brilliant people, smart people. Ricky Gervais has been on there, Jordan Peterson, Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro, Naomi Klein, all available on the Luminary app now. I also do a guided meditation every week on there to help you get back to some sort of reality after filling your head with all this kind of madness. And I'd love you to subscribe to my mailing list at russellbrand.com. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. It's a similar sort of area to this video. You'll probably like it, I would have thought. And if you want to meditate now or learn some stuff about spirituality and well-being, sign up to my side channel, Awakening with Russell Brand, so you can get the full picture. Thanks for watching.